Hello, and welcome to episode 15 of St. Luke's Gallery, which is also the final part of our series on sacred art in the Land of Rus. If you're new to St. Luke's Gallery, you may want to check out parts 1 through 4 first. For your convenience, you'll find links to the previous episodes in the show notes. We left off several weeks ago with the early part of the 20th century before the 1917 revolution. I've been a little late getting this final episode together, and I apologize, but my tardiness is somewhat apt because for decades after the Bolshevik Revolution and the start of the Soviet Union, sacred art in the Land of Rus came to a grinding halt. It would not emerge again in full force until the 1990s, but as you're about to see, the emergence of sacred art in this region has been impressive. And so without further delay, let's dive right in. I'm not going to spend this episode showing and talking about Soviet propaganda artwork. After all, St. Luke's Gallery is about sacred art. But here are two out of many examples of what people in the Land of Rus were faced with from the 1920s through the end of the 1980s. The 1920 poster on the left reads, "To have more, we must produce more. To produce more, we must know more." The tense arm slamming down the sickle onto the book is needless to say jolting. On the right, a Soviet stamp from 1961 reads, "Prepare the fight for the cause of the Communist Party." Don't the children here look quite happy? If you're familiar with Russian history during the 1920s and 1930s, you are well familiar with the destruction and cruelty the state showed towards the church. All over the region, churches were shuttered, converted to profane use, and often demolished. Shown here is the 1931 demolition of Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which was intended to be replaced with Joseph Stalin's Palace of the Soviets, which thankfully was never built. And thankfully, the Church of Christ the Savior was rebuilt, starting with permission from the government to the Orthodox Church in 1990. 10 years later, on Transfiguration Day in the year 2000, the cathedral was officially consecrated. Over 1 million of Moscow's citizens donated to the reconstruction of their beloved cathedral. Looking at the exterior here, it looks like the type of building that just isn't built anymore, and that's a sad fact. Modernism, whether in paintings, music, or architecture in a religious context, by and large removes the sacredness. I, and many of you, have seen countless examples where beautiful churches that were destroyed by war or fire were rebuilt into hideous monstrosities. Whether that was done intentionally or to simply do it as cheaply as possible, that's up for a case-by-case debate. In this case, consider how destitute much of the Russian populace was after the fall of communism when the ruble was so volatile. And yet, after all those decades of indoctrination by the state, they managed to raise funds for this beautiful cathedral to glorify God. And going inside, we can see the love for the sacred wasn't compromised either. Here we are looking up to see the fantastic interior of the cathedral's central dome. It's very, very rare in the 20th and 21st century to see such magnificence built from scratch for a church. I especially like the focal point of the Holy Trinity, with the 3 seraphim angels descending rapidly below. Let's move from Moscow to St. Petersburg, in a church that thankfully was not demolished after the revolution, though it was closed and used as a morgue during the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. This is the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood, and if you thought the iconic St. Basil's Church in Moscow's Red Square was detailed, I think it's safe to say that this one surpasses it. The church's construction began in 1883 and wasn't completed until 1907, which goes to show how detailed the church is. Alas, the church had 10 years until 1917's Bolshevik Revolution, when it was ransacked and severely damaged. After the Second World War, it was used as a warehouse for vegetables, and in 1970 it became a museum. But in 1997, it was reopened after an extensive restoration. And here is a look on the inside at that restoration. I used a clip of this in episode 1 of St. Luke's Gallery to show that an illiterate person could walk into this church and receive a catechism simply by meditating upon the icons which literally adorn the entire interior. Like the example we saw in the restored Cathedral of Moscow, there are no modernist compromises here. Russia's return to its Orthodox heritage post-communism is taking place without artistic compromise. Here I especially like the icon of Christ the Pantocrator above, looking down on the servants below, surrounded by the seraphim. Leading up to that, as we see in some of the traditional Roman Catholic churches, the four writers of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are shown just outside the entrance to the interior rotunda. Also note the beautiful scene of the Transfiguration just below. Everything here leads up to He that is above. So, what about icons? They've been a constant in the series, and well, yes, they are still being written in modern-day Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and here's a fine example by Tatiana Chirkova. This may have been written in the 21st century, but it has the same traditional style that has been seen in Russian icons since the early days of Christianity in that region. And as a further reminder, icons are written, not painted. This is another one of Tatiana's icons, the presentation of Jesus in the temple. Paintings and icons of the presentation aren't as common as the Nativity and the other mysteries from the joyful decades of the Rosary. I think this one is quite nice and a good one to say for meditation upon this important mystery when Simeon finally, at the end of his life, gets to not only see but hold the long-awaited Messiah. To give you all an idea of how Christianity has really emerged following the dark decades of communism, I present the series of postage stamps from Belarus circa 2018. The one of Hilda the Abbess on the left is interesting in that there isn't any gold, not even in her halo, when compared with the other two. Let's shift over from icons to paintings. Here's one from the Russian painter Ivan Glazunov titled Crucify Him. It was painted in 1994 and can be seen at the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow that we looked at earlier. Scenes of this topic from the book of Matthew abound in artwork, but this one is shown in the perspective of Jesus Christ versus the people of Israel. Note how Christ, after the scourging and the crowning of thorns, stands alone and silent, while Pontius Pilate and the Roman soldiers keep their distance and appear cautious. Not the case below with the people of Israel, clearly agitated and whipped up into a frenzy. Note how the faces of the people below are in torment, almost as if they are possessed. It's yet another great work of art to meditate upon. We see in Glazunov's painting that Christ came to fulfill the promise of the Messiah to the people of Israel, and they sadly rejected him. Here's a very recent and very dramatic painting by a relatively young artist, Ekaterina Morgan, who graduated from the Russian Academy of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture in 2008. Safetyalty Preaches to the Pagans at Rostov was created in that same year by Morgan and shows the Russian Orthodox saint arriving to bring Christianity. There are some great facial expressions here. St. Leonti, of course, has the necessary look of confidence, while his youthful assistant holding the candle looks more than a tad fearful. Scanning the faces of the pagans, some look suspicious, others look rather intrigued. I like how the focal point here isn't on any particular person, but rather on that beautiful crucifix, adorned in rays of gold and red from the two candles. Morgan really did her homework here. The attention to detail is meticulous, and I think she captured the harshness of the Russian climate well against the warmth of the crucifix. Here's a nice serene painting from the late Russian artist Pavel Ujenko, who tragically died of a stroke at the age of 44. Ujenko was known as an artist who captured significant events in Russian history, incorporating the people of those events with the environment. He was well known for showing battle scenes in the harsh winter climate. Here is a 2013 painting of Saint Sergio of Radonija, a spiritual leader and monastic reformer of medieval Russia and one of the Russian Orthodox Church's most venerated saints. This episode began with a look at the reconstructed Cathedral of Christ the Savior and the restoration of the Church of the Savior on spilled blood. I would like to close with a completely new church that was built recently in Russia. What you're looking at here is the Cathedral of the Russian Armed Forces, also known as the Cathedral of the Resurrection of Christ. This church, completed in the year 2020, was built in honor of the resurrection of Christ and is dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the victory in World War II and the previous victories of the Russian people in other armed conflicts. The exterior, shown here, features facades in metal, quite a change from other churches that used brick, stone, and tile. The design, however, remains true to Russian Orthodoxy, with the golden domes topped by the Orthodox crosses. Here we see the image of Christ above the main entrance, supported by two angels. It bears a striking resemblance to the Savior not made by hands, which we saw in the first part of the series, that you can see again in the lower right-hand corner. The angels look to me like three-dimensional versions of angels seen in early Russian Orthodox icons. So here is a church built in the 21st century that, at its very entrance, shuns the temptation of modernism and instead embraces the traditional iconography that has defined the Russian Orthodox Church for centuries. Shifting over to the interior, we see this very large and very elaborate mosaic of the Blessed Virgin and the Christ Child above the iconostasis. I've never seen the Virgin's face like this before, nor her stance. It's almost as if she's recognizing a threat and is calling upon the army of angels in the background to come to battle. And here is a wider view of the interior taken during the consecration ceremony. It is an impressive church, and again, it's inspiring to see that in the 21st century, there is still the interest to use the finest craftsmanship to glorify God. One interesting note about the floor here. The floors are metal, and specifically melted down metal from the Nazis using tanks and other weapons captured during the Second World War. Thus, walking on the floor symbolizes the triumph over fascism. Ironic that the forces triumphed, reporting to an officially atheistic nation, but things have obviously changed, and today Russia is unapologetically embracing its Christian heritage and incorporating it into the state, while much of the rest of the Western world is embracing secularism. And that concludes episode 15 of St. Luke's Gallery. I hope you've enjoyed the series on sacred art in the Land of Rus. I'll have a new episode in a few weeks, so until then, please visit stlukesgallery.com and also the channels on BitChute, Vimeo, Rumble, or YouTube. Questions or comments can be sent to mail@stlukesgallery.com. Thank you again, and may God bless you.